The speaker tonight is Mr. Evans Woollen. He was born in Indianapolis in 1927. Served in the Army 1945 through 47. Received his Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Architecture degree from Yale University in 1952. He worked in the offices of Paul Schweiker, Philip Johnson, and John Johansson. He opened his own office in 1955, and Nancy was saying at dinner tonight that had they been a little older and had more judgment, they might now have never opened the office. He's a corporate member of the AIA. He's registered in Indiana and Connecticut. He's now serving his second term on the National Committee on Aesthetics of the AIA. His publications include, and this is just a short list, The Architectural Record, May 1967, August 1961, November 1960, May 1957, February 1955, The Architectural Forum of June 1960, Fortune Magazine, October 64, February 65, Arts and Architecture Magazine, February 1966. In the Triennial Awards in Architecture given by the Indiana Society of Architects in 1965, his work won 2 honor awards and 1 merit award. I think the exhibit of the Triennial Awards was in the Union, and you may have seen that last month. In 1966 and presently, he is serving as a visiting critic at the University of Illinois in the Graduate School of Architectural Design. Without any further ado, I'll introduce Mr. Evans Woollen.
If I have to begin with an apology, quite an echo. You didn't give them the subject of my talk, Dick, which is entitled "The Radiant City Revisited," and I wish to begin with the apology that it is not a scholarly, in-depth review of the life and work of Le Corbusier. I'm not an historian. I wish I were. I'm interested in it. I'm simply a practicing architect, and it occurred to me to use the subject as an introduction of looking back at Le Corbusier's great contributions of the 20s and the 30s, and comparing them with some of our ideas today in the same field, and then eventually to show you some works of our office, again simply to draw out the spirit of our own age through these works, so that I can discuss them, compare them to the 1920s and the 30s, and hope to give you some representative feeling about what architects are thinking about, are aiming at right now, and doing this in contrast with the earlier part of the lecture. The whole thing is going to be very kaleidoscopic. I'm covering much too much material, I warn you, doing injustices to many places that are perhaps your favorite points in architecture or history. I want you to chide me when I'm through. I'm depending upon the question period is the liveliest part of the evening. This all began with my reading a book a couple of weeks ago. I didn't submit a title to you until a week ago. I found in Wittenborn's the first English edition of La Ville Radieuse, the monumental book of Le Corbusier, published in 1933. Actually, the English edition has been available for a couple of years, but that's about how far behind we are in our office. I won't say Indiana. At any rate, this was a great experience for me. It was great because of all the book has meant to architecture in the last decades, but it was even greater because I found the book very fresh, beautifully written in a staccato and also kaleidoscopic way. I think it used all the techniques heralded by Mr. McLuhan long before he was out and about. And I was struck after finishing the book with the extraordinary insight and prophecy that Le Corbusier had in general, how terribly right he was in some areas, and how, of course, he missed equally far in others. And it, as these things often do, made me think about today more effectively and profoundly than I'm able to when only today is with us. So I hope that I can recreate momentarily, at any rate, some of the pleasure that I got from this book. As a word about the scene, I should say, and the book, of course, does not acknowledge this, that prior to Le Corbusier's great productive period of the 20s and 30s and on, of course, but prior to the 20s, there was virtually only one figure who presaged the kind of drawing and thinking that he was to do. And that was at least only one figure that I know about. That was an Italian pre-World War I architect who did almost no actual building. His name was Sant'Elia. And he did marvelous drawings of cities of the future, extremely modern in the sense that we use the word, extremely architectural, free of any style, and involved with a kind of superhuman scale, with patterns of movement of power, people, rapid transit, water, so forth. And these were a kind of modern-day Piranesi, if you will. And I wish very much that I had some of his pictures to show you. But again, they are not the real point of the lecture. I only want to mention him to of course, acknowledge that no great thing comes out of a vacuum. There's always somebody behind the innovator in some minor way, perhaps, who sparks the greater innovation. And in this case, I believe that it could be Sant'Elia. Though Le Corbusier's book was published in 1933, it embodies drawings, ideas, and projects that he did continuously in the preceding 13 years. And he sometimes puts dates down and sometimes doesn't. They are actually fragments of speeches he's given, of conferences for his Congrès International of Architecture Moderne. It's a collage, so to speak. It even has his paintings from time to time, which are, of course, very revealing about his architecture. But in 1933, he got it all together and miraculously found a publisher. You must understand that he had still been able to build very little in terms of current day production. He had done one building in Moscow for the new Soviet Socialist republics. He had failed to win the competition for the League of Nations because it was drawn in ink and it was supposed to have been drawn in pencil or something, some technicality that was really a dodge because they were embarrassed to give him the award. He had, I think, put up a couple of relatively small buildings in Paris and 10 or 12 beautiful villas around and outside of Paris. He was born in 1888, and so he was 45 when this book was published. And I think that's very significant for us to keep in mind that it represents a relatively young man's spirit, because he changed in his outlook about some of these things later in life and later in the century. To me, at any rate, he is the architect of the 20th century, at least as we know it. And it's taken me a good many years to come to that conclusion. We're all very much attracted to Mr. Wright, and for many reasons, and including our Midwestern heritage and the extremely attractive and romantic nature of his architecture. And I'm no exception to that. But like most architects today, I'm terribly concerned with understanding our own age. And I feel that as the distance increases between us and Mr. Wright, that Mr. Wright was the great flowering of another generation. I'm interested tonight in cities, in Le Corbusier's 1933 view of cities, and of course we can recall that Wright was very uninterested in cities by and large. He did one famous city plan, which was really a division of the countryside. There was so much space and so much insularity that it can hardly have captured the spirit of the city at all. I believe he even expressed his dissatisfaction with cities, and that is a delightful 19th century approach which we simply can't afford anymore. On the other hand, Le Corbusier, in these early years, was worried about pollution. He was worried about education. He was worried about the densities that were going to be required. He was terribly worried about health. He saw people dying of tuberculosis in Paris all around him. In fact, he tells about the street on which he lived on the right bank, in a working man's quarter, where a certain shop, there was a turnover of owners on the average of every 2 years. They invariably died of tuberculosis in 2 or 3 years. They kept coming from the Auvergne, strong and healthy peasants, and operated this little, it was a wine shop, and in 2 or 3 or 4 years they would be dead because of the dampness, the lack of light, the medieval conditions that existed in this shop and in this street, and to some extent in the whole quarter. And he saw this all around him. He lived in a crumbling world that affected him very differently than it does us when we go back to see it. It seems very charming, and we romanticize about it. Few of us stay on to live permanently with it. And he grew up in it and had this very radical, extreme reaction. I'm going to show you his plans. which are done with a kind of Cartesian perfection in the great French tradition of Lenotre, the landscape gardener, of Mansart, and all the great architects who were more severe, in a sense, more classic, more self-denying than any other architects we can think of as in a period, the Romans, the Greeks, or the Renaissance. And Le Corbusier inherited this tradition, and especially at this time. He was a great, he suffered a great reaction against the garden city idea that was then current in England. The idea that we would move from the city cores out to garden cities, and everybody would have a lot of land around them, and that everything would be beautiful, and that would be a kind of fantasy of living in the country and yet having some advantages of the city. This English idea is, of course, also akin to Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre city. Corbu would have none of it. He wished to demolish the old cities. He wished a new city to rise in its stead, a vertical city, a city on stilts, a city that maintained almost a completely open landscape. It was a utopia, actually. He wanted it to be completely egalitarian. Nobody was to be without sunlight. Nobody was to be without all of the amenities, and everybody was to have almost equal facilities. And there were to be no hierarchy. There were no better quarters or lesser quarters. One assumed that everybody made the same amount of money, that everybody had the same interests, and of course he fell into a danger of regimenting things. At the same time, he felt that he was giving people freedom. Freedom to have all the things that they didn't have in his back alley on the right bank. But what kind of freedom we'll have to decide when we see the pictures. This great idealism turned sour after 1933, little by little, and we have to think about that, why it did. Of course, he got older, and his ideas were not implemented. That would be enough, perhaps, for one man. But there were, I think, many other reasons. The spirit of the age had been conducive to a utopia. The Russians were still exciting to a great many people in Europe, what they were doing with their republic. Nobody understood yet what the outcome of communism would be. Many people, including perhaps Le Corbusier, had great hopes for Russia. The League of Nations was another almost utopian idea. People in America were undergoing prohibition, which was a naive and an interesting idea. The Depression hadn't taken place yet. But of course, it had by 1933. But how much Le Corbusier felt it, or is reflected in this book that stretches from 20 to 33, is hard to say. The Great War had been fought and won, the war to end wars. And then we also have to think of what Paris meant in those years to the rest of the world. It was the city of light. It was the Mecca for many Americans, many English people, for writers and painters. It was an enormously stimulating place, and you can forgive almost anybody for being utopian, it seems to me, when you read of the people who were at this next sidewalk cafe and what they were talking about in the books they were writing. It was Proust's age, a far cry from the Camus to follow in another much more sober age, which Le Corbusier lived to see. It was a less complex world, we think. I don't know, because I wasn't there. I think we might go on to the slides. How do I work this, Dick? Is this fine? Here is the La Ville Radieuse, the radiant city, occupying the center of Paris, entirely new construction everywhere, the total city eradicated. It has no trace of style. Le Corbusier is violently anti-Beaux-Arts. He believes it has total freedom, that it has a total integration of transportation systems, total equality. A great asset of his thinking to the people who followed was his insistence on three dimensions. Planners, up till this time, with the single exception of Saint-Hilaire, had often made the mistake of not thinking in three dimensions. Le Corbusier's great criticism of the 19th century planner Baron Haussmann, who carved Paris into the city that it is as we know it, put the great avenues in and the great focal points, built the opera, some of the bridges, was that Haussmann thought only in plan. He did not think about height. He did not think about verticality. It was a one-dimensional plan, and Le Corbusier lamented this to the end of his life. Le Corbusier thought a great deal about the automobile when there weren't very many automobiles around, and very few people took him seriously. That roads were going to have to be wider, that intersections were going to have to be planned, that people and cars should be separated. This was as early as 26 when he was saying these things. He did finally acknowledge that a few of the great monuments could be spared. He was going to spare them in isolation. The Pantheon, Notre Dame, and the Louvre were going to be allowed to stay. And I think that Sacré-Cœur on the far right. Everything else must go, and these things would stand rather painfully in great green open parks. Of course, as they never had stood at any time in their history. And I want to talk later about our current ideas of older buildings, because this is so obviously one of Le Corbusier's discredited ideas, that there was no respect for the existing environment, which we're so concerned about today. Here is a little slice of the Paris that Corbu both loved and hated. He had this kind of relationship to it as he might to his mother. He rejected it on the one hand, and he was terribly drawn to it on the other. He lets himself slip every once in a while and muses about the history of Paris, about what all these things mean and its great tradition. But very specifically, he rejected in his own plans and thoughts the close-packed courtyards, the buildings looking only at themselves, the intricacy, the tunnels, the medieval quality, many of the things that we've grown to like again in 1966 were rejected by Corbu. And again, looking back at the health conditions, at the great spirit of change which he wished to institute, we can see why. This is taken from Notre Dame, looking north. This is possibly the dullest, but to your eyes, but the most significant slide, really, that I have to show you about my subject. This is his ground plan for the La Ville Red Use. And even though he decried judging things only by ground plans, we still must take some stock of them, and they are terribly indicative. As I hope you can see from a distance, the business center is locked into a series of very tall towers at the north end of the city, surrounded by green parks. The railroad station and the terminal occur here. Hotels and embassies would be allowed to spring up in this strip. The housing occurs in this area. And these are actually row houses, perhaps 10 or 15 stories high. Again, giving sunlight and space to everybody, but terribly monotonous. You can imagine trying to identify yourself with this apartment unit here, or this one over here. Beautifully connected by roads and paths and speeder systems and all of that sort of thing. A green strip insulating you from the factories, the warehouses, and finally the heavy industry. We have to assume that the prevailing wind in France is from the north and not from the southwest as it is here. But if he thought of anything, he certainly would have thought of that sort of thing, because he's so concerned with the social and physical problems. Well, now you may see what I mean by Cartesian. You may see what I mean by purism, how wonderfully naive, what a brave new world this represents, and what we can learn by it by looking back at it. This was a perspective of the business area of the La Ville Red Use, and this was done in 1924, this drawing, and Le Corbusier, in the 1964 edition of his book, penned a little note at the bottom saying that it's rather interesting that this was the first traffic underpass that was ever drawn, that was ever envisaged by man. That in 1924, that you would have to handle intersections by putting them at different levels. And it's really hard for the young mind to comprehend this, because it's such a obvious and common occurrence in our highways and our architecture. This is England in 1949. I'm really now jumping to this period after the Second War. This was done by the London County Council. A number of architects. I don't think we can ascribe it to anyone, but we certainly can describe the heavy influence of La Ville Red Use on the general philosophical approach, even though it's just in an isolated neighborhood. But I do want to say, to mention the great shifts that have occurred since the 1933 epic date. The kind of rise of disillusion on the part of many people, the appearance of existentialism, the appearance of the writer Camus, the atom bomb, the post-depression of the war, and the realization of what the Nazis had done was really kind of a setback for the human spirit in a simple way. I think many people had to adjust to it. It was hard to believe that so elemental a thing had happened. Of course, there's the great technological gap since 1933. We had, by this time, many more things to deal with and not the time or the outlook to assimilate them as fast as they were coming. This is still, of course, increasingly a problem, and I won't dwell on that except to remind you that it's part of the age. We have a renewed social concern, a much wider one than was held in Le Corbusier's France, concerned with racial problems, concerned with poverty, a population explosion. I think Corbu could see an explosion coming, almost wanted one to justify his theories. But by 49, it had arrived. All of these things began to lead to some new outlooks, and to one very important, essential outlook, which I'll get to in just a minute. This is Roehampton in England in the early 50s. Again, very much Le Corbusier, with a little less rigidity, a little more life to it. And now we will jump to the plug-in city of 1964. The thing I most wanted to say was that the post-World War II feelings about planning and about cities were beginning to lead to the conclusion that Corbusier never entertained at all, and that is that the city is never finished, that we cannot do one plan that will serve mankind for any continuing length of time, that the whole organism of the city is an evolving accretion of different ideas and different people and different generations and different outlooks, and that we can only go so fast with it, that obsolescence is taking place so fast that we must meet it, and meet it in a number of ways. I show this plan, which is really an elevation of a city, to you, because it's one of the few very visionary, completely avant-garde city plans since Le Corbusier, done by a group of Englishmen, Peter Cook chief among them. And though it may not tell us too much about the future, I think it does, or about today, it does have some very essential points to be made, and the chiefest among them is obsolescence. These young men have decided, unlike Corbusier, that the city is constantly changing, and that they will design one for this change. And it's set up not on the ruins of the old city, but outside. They leave the old city and will let it just presumably fall apart. It's done, of course, with cranes, which are working all the time, either taking the city down or putting it up. You see them. And they give us with it a table of relative permanence. Bathrooms or kitchens are replaced in 3 years. The living rooms, 5 years. The bedroom units, 8 years. I can't tell you why the bedrooms have more longevity than the other. The whole location of the housing unit is 15 years. A local shop, 3 years. The main structure, which is holding the whole thing up, has a maximum life of 40 years. This is the other half of the drawing of the plug-in city. You can see that the bathrooms, the living rooms, the housing units can all be taken in and pushed out again and reconnected This is a plug-in tower, an office building, with the crane constantly at work replenishing the basic structure. Now we jump to our latest visionary. Well, it's more than visionary because it's actually been built in part. This is the original model for habitat at Expo, and it was thought that all of this would be built. It later became apparent that it was terribly expensive. That each housing unit cost $110,000. Each apartment unit cost $110,000. But even this didn't deter them, and they built what you can now see in Montreal. And as you probably know by the much publicized structure, the apartments fit into each other in an extremely complicated but rational plan of assemblage. They have no structure the way the plug-in city did. They are self-supporting, which is one of the reasons that it's so expensive, and one of the single criticisms which I've read about it. But it does give some feeling of the progression since 1933 of a city with variety. They're not trying to give every unit sunlight necessarily, or equal amenities. They're trying to give them all some amenities, but different amenities. They're not trying to be understood at the first glance the way Le Corbusier's plan could. They want to be apparently irrational and intricate, and it's kind of like moving a Greek island hill town to Montreal. It could have been done without the same cost, I think. Here's a close-up of the units and how they fit together. Well, I want to get back to America and some of our everyday problems in Indiana. This is not Indiana, but actually Litchfield, Connecticut. We are not able to destroy our cities and rebuild them. Our cities have some beautiful aspects. They have some maddening ones. One of the ones is the interesting and curious tradition of building houses way back from the streets in broad lawns with great right-of-way streets where you don't need them, and narrow streets where you do need wide ones. All the problems of setback and zoning that we encounter that make it difficult to adapt radically and quickly to new needs. But of course, we have very treasured things like this that we don't want to keep, we don't want to get rid of, even when they are obsolete. This street was specifically designed with the most important consideration in mind at that time in that town, which was that two herds of sheep could pass each other without getting confused or without losing any sheep. I simply want to show you this picture to remind ourselves that great highways, this is a Roman aqueduct, by the way, and it was carrying water. It was a very utilitarian thing, and it's still very beautiful. And great highways and raised highways, indeed, can be beautiful. And many of our utilitarian things which we try to bury or are embarrassed about or assign to hacks to design could also be an attribute. Often the thing that we worry about most in the landscape could be the most effective if we would remember the aqueduct and approach it in a fresh spirit. I want to think about open space, or I want you to think about it. Here's the space in front of the Louvre. I can't help but feeling that it was a space like this that Corbu treasured because of the claustrophobia of the place where he lived and where almost everybody in Paris lived, and that he was trying to perpetuate or to greatly multiply open space like this, which of course we realize now is only so meaningful when it's enclosed by intricacy and by small spaces. That by itself it is not so overwhelming an advantage. Here's a great space in another city, Central Park, a city which also Corbu loved and hated. He loved the vitality and decried the random and wild skyline, which Americans even then admired, and which we admire even more in the same way we do the skyline of Habitat. Here's a great space in Central Park, and of course it is meaningful for its periphery and for its topography, and not for its dimensions alone. These are the spaces that Corbu decried most of all: the Renaissance courtyard, the enclosed, claustrophobic space, which we begin to appreciate again, which we need to use with open space. This is one of the colleges at Cambridge. I've forgotten which. This is Clare College, Cambridge. And in our cities, influenced by such people as Kevin Lynch at MIT, and by a much earlier writer, Camilo Sit of Vienna in the late 19th century, we're again concerned over surprise, over a certain amount of irrationality, coming from archways into sunlight, focal points, and directing the eye in a continuous progression, an unwinding, unfolding experience, rather than a completely registered experience. I apologize for the dimness of this slide. This is Orvieto, and of course it sums up a city as an organism that we're getting to think about more and more, a living organism rather than a hard mechanical plant. Here's the cathedral. There's the town tower, the civic center of the town, and the organism radiates out from it in the countryside, reaches up and feeds it with grapes and bread and wine and all that it needs. It's an extremely natural and wonderful occurrence on this gently sloping table of volcanic rock. And it's a rather startling jump from Orvieto to Indianapolis. But this is what we deal with. This is what we have to think about, and we have to always make this jump. Some of us go to Europe and cannot bring home anything to apply to our lives, and that's the important thing. We are tied to a place. Architects and other people are tied to places, and we must commit ourselves to them, identify with them, and give them something. Here is the first appearance of one of our buildings, which is rising on the far right within an urban fabric. It respects, I hope, the buildings that are around it, the Woollen Germanic Athenaeum of 1900, the great Egyptian temple of 1910, and the smaller, more regularized buildings that create a fuss, so to speak, in front of our building. And our building looks to the center of town, on this radial avenue, which may slowly be eaten away by people who discovered that it's very cheap to buy both sides of the avenue because you can then have the middle for free. So I don't know how long that will last. But again, that's part of the obsolescence, the evolving nature of the city. And you do a building thinking about the continuity of its surroundings, not thinking about a totally new plan, thinking about that this will last for some time, that this will last for some time, that when they're replaced, if the next guy thinks about it, that little by little, you will have a continually reassuring and satisfactory city. Here is a study of Indianapolis done by the University of Illinois, the master's class, called Indianapolis Centrum. And I show it to you in contrast with Indianapolis as it is, because it's kind of Indianapolis that will never exist. It's a visionary plan, not as visionary as Peter Cook or Corbu, and not as exciting. But it does represent concerns of today. You'll notice that all the avenues have been taken away, I believe, in their entirety. This is a shadow, I believe, not an avenue anymore. Well, they left a little bit of one up here. But I asked the students when I saw them after they'd done this why they did that, and they said, "Oh, the traffic was so difficult at the intersection of those avenues, so we took them away." They decided that Indiana University and Purdue University would function best if they were all in one building. So they made a big building which goes all the way over to the University Park. University Park finally becomes University Park again. They dredged the river out and brought the water in to the state office building, created a theater here, the exhibition center, which is going to be built approximately on this site, and may very well look like this. It's the most realistic aspect. This is the sports center that is projected. And the Indiana National Bank building, I believe on this intersection, has spawned 3 others that are exactly like it because they thought it looked better to be symmetrical. This is a hard thing to accomplish from a real estate point of view. The gray buildings are existing. The study has many interesting ideas. The reintroduction of housing in the inner city. A great deal of thought has gone into the peripheral neighborhoods of the core and how they can feed the core. It's easy to criticize this plan. I'm very happy that it was done, and I think it should be stimulating to anybody who looks at it, whether they agree with everything or not. This is what cities the size of Indianapolis or Muncie or any place ought to have at frequent intervals. Here's a small study of a neighborhood in Indianapolis that our office did. A neighborhood, a very difficult neighborhood that you wouldn't even characterize as a neighborhood unless you felt our study helped to give it some such quality. It's from Meridian Street to Delaware, from 16th to 22nd. And Indianapolis suffers, as so many American cities do, from being eviscerated by ribbon streets that slice neighborhoods into kind of bacon stripes, and you feel no organic quality of living in a section of the city that isn't invaded by people going to another section. So we propose closing Talbot, closing Pennsylvania, and making all of these little streets serviceable only for the residents, since it would be inconvenient to either use it as a crosstown traffic or as a through uptown, downtown traffic section. And this may never be done. We hope it will be. The Planning Commission looks upon it favorably in a kind of sleepy long-term way, but we're convinced that there's a lesson in this, and that it would be far more desirable to live in a new house or an old house in such a neighborhood if you had the feeling that you were entering the gates of your neighborhood when you came down one of these little quieter streets. I want to talk momentarily about old buildings, and Le Corbusier left 2 or 3. We're inclined to leave more. We're inclined to leave an urge that any building be left that is structurally sound, reasonably structurally sound, and could have a use in the future. Here was possibly the most grandiose building ever put up in Marion County, the Marion County Courthouse in 1869 by an architect who just come back from Napoleon III's Paris, where he lived for 10 years. And it was a thrilling building in perfect structural condition. It needed interior superficial repairs. It needed to be fumigated. I am perfectly sure in my own mind that it could have been justified as saving and as a useful structure for court functions, for chambers of officials, and for a very educational, very thrilling reminder to our grandchildren of another era and a more optimistic one, even more optimistic than 1933. I'll get back now to the subject of continuity, showing you some ways that we, in our work, have tried to consider this, exemplify it. This is Jordan Hall at Butler University. It was the principal building on the campus when we were commissioned to work on Blues Hall. We told the trustees that if we were hired, we would try very hard to evolve a building that belonged, without copying, that belonged with the buildings that were there. And two firms were hired at the same time, Yamasaki's and ours. Mr. Yamasaki did the library, which you may have seen, and I do not believe gave the trustees the same message, or was even asked the same question. And this was the result of our attempt. This is the interior shot of the lobby, and this does not have any relationship in continuity to the interior of Jordan Hall, but it does have some relationship to the interest today in space, in apprehending space slowly, and intricacy of space, the same way directly parallel with the intricacy of space in a city plan, of being able to go around corners and have things unfold slowly without its being given away at one time. This is another lesson or example of continuity. And here the predecessor was of a different character than Jordan Hall. This is a beautiful building by Paul Cray, one of the really fine American architects of the early part of the 20th century. Practiced in the East, and he actually did buildings all over the country. And this is one of his very late buildings, about 1927, the John Herring Art School. And we were commissioned to do what was termed an addition to it. It was actually a separate building, but connected to it, housing similar functions for the art school. And in this way, we evolved the plan of Fessler Hall, which takes its spirit as reverently as possible from the Cray building, both in materials and in proportions, if not details. This is the Cray building on the far right and our building on Pennsylvania Street. And you will notice certain similarities in the rhythms, vertical proportions, and materials, although the structure is different. The Cray building is a steel structure and ours is exposed concrete. Without any embarrassment, expressions of our age creep into this obligation to be continuous. This is a very small house in the country outside of Indianapolis. I show it here with a little bit of embarrassment, but even because I'm embarrassed, I think it's important to tell you about it. Houses in the country are a kind of a disappearing thing, a disappearing concern for the architect. He can't help feeling that that there are fewer and fewer people in the world who are able financially and emotionally to escape the city and build a castle of their own. It's a wonderful thing to do, these houses. I don't resent that at all. I just want to point out the feeling that it is not part of the future mainstream of architecture. This is another house, a much larger one, from Mr. Mallory in Indianapolis, and does, if it shows nothing else, an interest in the site, a hillside site, and how a house can take the hill, can grow from the hill, and assume different levels for different functions. Each square of the house houses a different set of functions that fit into the main function of the great living room in the center. Here's another building on a less than urban site. It's a credit union and tries to articulate the offices, the reception areas, and the main council chamber where the credit union, it's a credit union league, where the credit union directors from all over the state meet on a monthly basis to make their decisions. An opera house for Indiana University, which is not yet constructed, again shows a concern for each function declaring itself in an expressive way on the outside of the building. The lobbies, the theater proper, the house proper, the stage house, the elevators and the stairwells to the stage house, the staircases and elevators for the public, the staircases and elevators for the actors, the singers, the musicians, and the rehearsal spaces. I like to kind of think of this building as an automobile or a machine of some kind in which you take it immediately for what it is and how it's operating, how it moves and breathes. It is a symmetrical building, and I say that with neither pride or shame. The operation of a theater is a rather symmetrical operation. People come in and they have to go in on the sides in equal amounts. They have to sit in a fairly symmetrical arrangement in order to give the scene designer freedom on the stage. There have been unsymmetrical theaters, but rather few of them, and they tend to have a forced quality. Here is the site for a federal building, which we're planning for downtown Indianapolis. It's the War Memorial Plaza. I only show it to you to remind you of the context in which this building must go. The great open space, the various vertical elements of Riley Center, of the War Memorial, of Scottish Rite, of the obelisk, which surround this site, and hence we have a defiantly horizontal building to contrast with those vertical elements. It's also backwards. Sorry to say, this is one we didn't catch, Dick. But at any rate, it will sit on the side of this park. It will be surrounded by tall structures, and it will help, we hope, to enclose the park, to take away the windswept feeling of prairie that you now get with nothing but cannons and abandoned tanks that are placed there. This is a mock-up model at full scale of one of the windows of that building. It's rather irrelevant, but I did want to show you that occasionally architects still build full-scale models, because nothing else shows you the proportions as well. In fact, we learned a good deal about building this model, and I think it paid for itself through the effort. There was an architect in the 30s in Germany, a guy named Hugo Herring, who said something that's rather haunting to me now, and I hope applies to some of the buildings I've been showing you. He said, quote, "We want to uncover the various elements and permit them to develop their own form. It goes against our principle to force them into predetermined shape or to apply to them any derivative law." This is a small library that we're doing for Marion College campus. These are the stacks on the upper floors, reading rooms around the lower floor, and a great central well with a reading space around the stacks in the middle. This is a building for the Cummins Engine Company in Columbus, Indiana, and I hope it, more than any other, exemplifies this passage from Hugo Herring. It's a recreational building, and this is the gymnasium, which receives light, which has a long span, and these are various functions around the gymnasium: craft rooms, playrooms, a lounge, game rooms, and a shop. And these are handball courts at the back with the lockers. This is the chimney for the lounge. This building is out in the country, reaches out in the land. It does not have any urban context at all. There are no nearby buildings. It's setting the style, if you will, for buildings to come, if they come, and it is a functional mechanism for the entertainment, the relaxation of the employees of this company. We built a fieldstone. It will be surrounded by trees, and tries to be useful but uninstitutional. In closing, I would show you our public housing for the elderly that you saw in the slide of Indianapolis earlier, and which is now under construction. This is a floor plan that shows you that the small apartments are on the first 14 stories, and they're designed for one person, and the large apartments are on the stories above 15, from 15 to 21, and they're designed for two people. They are minimal, as the government demands. Each one does get sunlight. The building is oriented east and west. Each person is as close as possible to the elevator. They are economical, of course, because they're on a single loaded corridor.